to video 2A. For this particular segment, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to look at types of ownership, registration and titling, and special use options. So what are types of ownership available? Let's talk about fee simple. This gives you the maximum capability to use in determining how property, land, can be in fact used. You have all of the rights associated with it. The next level deals with a life estate, and this is a situation where you may have granted to another individual the use of land for their lifetime. The key feature about this particular format is that when the person to whom the land had been granted passes away, then the rights return back to the grantor or the grantor's estate. A lease. And when you have a leasehold, as a tenant, you have rights. And the rights that you have for that land is for the period of the contract, whether it's for a year or some other unit of measure. When the contract expires, all rights to the land have now expired with it. We also can have ownership, which might be with multiple owners, and that's known as a concurrent ownership. And there are two formats that come into this category. You could be joint, where two or more people have equal shares of a particular piece of land. And with that, you also have the availability of something known as survivorship rights, which means that when one of the persons dies, then ownership transfers to the remaining or surviving people. Compared to a situation where you have tenants in common. And here what you have are different sizes of ownership. Maybe it's one person has 80% and another person has 20%. In that situation, there are no survivorship clauses in effect. And I think you could infer by that, the reason being someone would unduly gain or suffer if it was passed on to another person. Whereas when it's an equal amount, then there is a fairness that goes along with it. When we have our land rights, along with that comes a couple of duties and also a couple of administrative things to go with it. We have deeds, and a deed allows us to transfer our land to someone else, and it is a formal recording of that transfer of ownership. The issue at hand, though, is all about the registration. The registration is the recording and also the public notice that a particular event has occurred and a transfer of real property. There are also some special applications that can be done or used. And the first we'll talk about are easements. Easements are a legal rite of passage. We have those all over the place. You might have them in your yard, you may have them in your neighborhoods where the utility companies can come in and do whatever work needs to be done, either to read a meter or to do a maintenance on a particular utility. You can also have easements which just allow for certain factions of the government to be able to come in and access that particular land without causing undue damage because they are on, technically, some private property, public property on your private property. Another application deals with the concept of bailments. And with a bailment, what you are doing is basically being a person who gives permission to someone to, as they give you something, they have a full expectation of you giving it back to them. An example might be, my neighbor has a garage with some spare space. Another person in the neighborhood across the street has an additional collector's car, but he doesn't have a place to store it. So he in turn approaches my neighbor and says, "May I store my car in your garage?" That property, in this case his personal property, has been given over to my neighbor, who accepts responsibility for taking the vehicle into her garage. But the original person who gave the car to my neighbor has a full expectation of getting it back. A couple of examples of easements and bailments might look something like this. You could have, for the utility company, the land on which they run their power cables. Or in the case of a neighborhood, you can see where there are areas that have been blotted out that show the routes and paths in which an easement access into a particular house or property does exist. On the lower panels, I have two visuals, one being a car parking garage area or parking lot where when you bring and place your car into a particular space and you're paying for the access to leave your car there, you have every intention of getting your car back after you've concluded your business. And similarly, when you bring clothes to a dry cleaner and they take responsibility for those clothes, there's a bailment type of a relationship that exists where you expect, upon the payment for the service and the claim check, to receive your goods back. That concludes 2A.